Have you ever seen a champagne tower? Or maybe have you ever tried to do a champagne tower yourself? If you're not familiar with a champagne tower or what that means, what I'm talking about is something like I've got here, where people arrange champagne glasses in a pyramid with a lot on the base and then less on each level going up until there's only one champagne glass at the top. Because the idea of a champagne tower is that you pour the champagne into the glasses, not each individual glass, but that you pour it into the top glass. And the theory is that if you keep pouring into that top glass, that it will keep flowing from that glass into the glasses of the level below it, and below that, and below that, until when you keep pouring into the top glass, all the glasses are full of champagne. If you've got enough champagne for all the glasses. And so I thought I'd give it a go. Now, these aren't champagne glasses, as you can probably tell, and one significant difference, if you have a look at this one I have here, is that the base is a bit narrow. In the saucer kind of old-fashioned champagne glass, the base is as wide as the top, and so it flows a little bit better. I've had a couple of attempts at this, but the idea is that if I pour water into the top one, it should hopefully flow into the glasses below it. I'm not sure how successful this is going to be. Look, after the video, you might want to go and try it yourself. So you can go and raid your kitchen, find either some old champagne glasses or some plastic cups, or try something like that, and see whether it works for you. So here we go. This is my attempt at a champagne tower using my water and plastic glasses. Start pouring it in. When it gets to the top, it starts to flow over into the glasses below it. And then the third level. It keeps going. So it goes all the way to the bottom. Or something like that. You get the idea. Unfortunately, here in the church, we actually have a sloping floor, so I've had to try to correct it. But I think that gives you the idea of what a champagne tower is all about. If you keep filling the top glass, it flows into the next glass, and the glasses on the next level, until theoretically at least, all the glasses are full of champagne. I like the champagne tower for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it just looks really cool. When it's done well, it can look really effective. And so maybe you might like to go onto YouTube and have a look and see if there are some video clips of what a real champagne tower looks like. But the other reason I like this kind of illustration is that for me it's a picture of the way in which God's goodness and God's love and God's grace is at work in our lives, but also through us in the lives of people around us. For example, in Psalm 67, the psalmist, the person who wrote the psalm, writes these words: "May God be gracious to us and bless us, and make his face shine on us, so that your ways may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations." So that's Psalm 67 verses 1 and 2. I'm reading from the New International Version because there are a couple of differences in this translation from other translations, and this one is a little bit closer to the original Hebrew, and I might talk more about that in a little bit. But it's a beautiful prayer, for starters, just in verse 1, because the person comes to God looking for God's grace, God's blessing, and for God's face to shine on him. There is so much in these words, there is so much meaning in the language that the psalmist is using. I've had a number of attempts at doing this video, but it's just gone way too long. So if you want more information, more detail about the meaning behind the language that is in this psalm, I encourage you to have a look at my written message, because I can go into more detail there. But what this person is doing is they're coming to God and they're looking for God's grace, God's blessing, and for God's face to shine on them. They whatever is going on in their lives, they recognise that they need the grace of God, that they need God's blessing in their life, and they need God's face to shine on them. Just this whole idea of God's face shining is a beautiful image, because it means that when God looks at us, his face lights up. His face lights up with approval and with love, because he's pleased with us, because he sees Christ in us. And so this is a prayer of hope. It's a prayer of one of God's people coming to God, looking for God's goodness in their lives. Now, sometimes it can be awkward for us to pray a prayer like this, to pray with the psalmist, asking God to be gracious to us, to bless us, and for his face to shine on us. Sometimes we can just find it hard to ask God for things for a range of reasons. Other people can look at this idea of asking God to bless us and sort of think about churches that take this to an extreme and look for prosperity and a whole lot of material blessings in their lives. Personally, I don't think we should shy away from a prayer like this, because as God's people who live in his grace, who receive his blessings every day and who live with God's shining face on us, we can still need that sometimes. We can still hope for that. And so coming to God and asking for him to show us his grace and his blessing and for his face to shine on us, it's a prayer of faith. It's trusting that God will do this for us. And in Jesus, that's what we believe he will. That God does show us unending grace. That God does pour his blessings into our lives like I can pour blessed water into these glasses. That his face does shine on us. And so trusting that God is gracious, that he does bless us and his face shines on us, whatever's going on in our lives, we can come to him in faith, looking for his grace, looking for his blessing, and asking his face to shine on us. So one of the things I encourage you to do is to think about your life where maybe you need a special portion of God's grace, where maybe in your life you need his blessing in one way or another, where you want him to look on you and to smile and for his face to light up when he sees you. Because trusting in these promises, we can come to him in faith and we can continue to search for and hope for his grace and his blessing and his shining face on us. But what some translations miss out in these verses anyway, and what's significant is what happens next. You see, the psalmist who's writing this isn't just thinking of himself as an individual cup who just wants to be full to overflowing with God's grace and blessing and with God's face to shine on him. He's not just thinking of himself individually and looking for this grace and blessing just for himself. Instead, the psalmist seems to understand that like each of these glasses are connected to each other, so every person is connected to each other in one way or another. And so the other thing, he's not just coming asking for himself, he's asking on behalf of his community of faith. This is something that he is asking for all of his people, that God would show them grace and blessing and God's face would shine on them so that his ways and his salvation might be known by all peoples and by all nations. These words, so that, actually really reflect the Hebrew very well. And it's something that some translations miss out on, which is why I'm using the New International Version in this. Because you see, he doesn't just see receiving God's grace and blessing as an end in itself, but as a way for his grace and blessing to be known by others through him. And so that's why I'm using this illustration of the champagne tower. Because as God's grace and blessing pours into the cup on the top, it overflows. Like we read in Psalm 23, the cup overflows with grace and blessing into the lives of others and others and others. And so it becomes this cascade of God's flowing grace and blessing coming from the person who wrote the psalm through his community into the world around him. And so just like all of these glasses are connected, we are connected to other people, family, friends, people that we work with, people that we study with. We're all connected. And this prayer is not just about receiving God's grace and blessing for ourselves, but that's so that God's grace and blessing can overflow from our lives into the lives of the people around us, so that they can know his ways, they can know the salvation of our God through Jesus. Now, this whole idea of knowing is pretty important, and it's something that I'd like to spend more time thinking about, because we tend to understand knowing very much as information. We live in an information age. And so we think of knowing as knowing about things. But that's not the way the ancient Hebrews understood knowing. For them, knowing was, it had that sort of knowing about kind of part to it, but it was also knowing something. The kind of difference, the way I think about it, is that I can know what the weather is by pulling out my phone and looking at my app and seeing what the app is telling me about the weather outside. That's knowing about the weather. But to know the weather means to experience it, to get outside and to feel the sun on my face, or the rain on my head and on my shoulders, or the wind in my face. To know about something is to kind of know something in an intellectual sense, in a head sense, but to really know something means to experience it, to live in its reality, for it to surround us and wash over us, so that we know it, not just know about it. And we can apply this to lots of different things. Particularly in this scripture, though, it's talking about knowing God's ways, knowing his salvation. Again, this isn't just an intellectual approach to the Christian faith. We're not just talking about doctrines and theology. We're talking about the lived experience of living in the reality of God's grace and blessing as it flows from other people and it flows into our lives. As we experience grace and blessing from God through people around us, or as other people experience God's grace and his blessing through us as it flows from us into the lives of people around them, then they get to know about the goodness of God. They get to know about the ways of God, which lead to life rather than death and destruction. Now, these ways, lots we could talk about, but it's basically the way of living in the way that Jesus taught. To be trusting him and to be loving others, to be loving God with all our heart, mind, soul and strength, and loving others as ourselves, to be loving each other the way that Christ loves us, or as Paul says in Galatians 5:6, to be following the way of faith and love. These are the ways of God that we learn through Jesus. These are the ways that lead to life, not just life eternal in heaven when we die, but that life to the full that Jesus came to promise us, that Jesus came to give us through his life, death and resurrection for us. And so it's about people beyond ourselves experiencing these ways of God, the ways that Jesus leads us into, to experience life through us. And so as we live in God's grace and blessing, people actually come in contact with, like the glasses in my pyramid, in my tower, people actually come into contact with the goodness of God so that they can know for themselves in an experience kind of way. They can know the ways of Jesus that lead to life. It's also possible for them to know salvation, to know what it means to live in the reality of God's saving love. Again, this isn't just a theological idea. It's not just about a hope for heaven when we die, but to know the salvation of Jesus means to live in the reality of God's saving love for us in Jesus, love that frees us from sin and death and the power of the devil. It releases us and liberates us from fear and guilt and shame controlling our lives, and it brings about a new reality of peace and joy and hope and eternal and perfect love in Jesus. Salvation is just as much about the life that we live here and now as it is about the life we'll live forever in heaven. It begins now and it lasts forever. And so when the psalmist prays that through the grace and blessing that God pours into his life, others might know the ways of God that lead to life rather than death and destruction, and they might live in the reality of God's salvation, of his saving love that brings joy and peace and hope right here, right now. This isn't just something that is poured into every person's life individually, because we are all connected. We live in a complex network of relationships which God pours his grace and blessing into. Whether we think of this individually or whether we think of this as a community of faith, like my champagne tower with my dodgy plastic glasses and the water that I pour into it, we're all connected. And this psalm, this prayer, is about God pouring his grace and his blessing into our lives as his face shines on us, so that through us, through our relationships with other people, they might experience the reality and know for themselves what it's like to live in the ways of God that bring life and to live in his salvation. Don't be afraid to ask God for what you need in order to do that. Keep praying for God to be working through you, to be pouring his grace and blessing into you so that others can encounter it, can experience, can know it as their reality as they come into contact with God's life-giving ways and in his saving love. God be with you. God give you what you need so that you can live for him.